Angelica simply couldn't understand why she, whose instantaneous techniques were unmatched in the world, couldn't even defeat a lowly adventurer today. Worse, the male protagonist suspected her of having secured her position in the Knight's Order through backdoor connections. Little did she know that to Rick, her movements appeared as slow as a snail's. Rick couldn't help but wonder if he might actually be stronger after all, which was understandable given that his masters were the strongest adventurers on the continent, and the training he had undergone was nothing short of hellish. The constant belittlement from his masters led him to believe that they represented only the starting point of combat power on the continent. After successfully graduating, Rick planned to register his level at the Adventurers Guild. He learned that to obtain an adventurer's identity, he would need to pass a test. No sooner had he completed the procedures than a drunkard approached the front desk, causing trouble. With a spirit of helping others, Rick quickly patted the man's chest to sober him up, and sure enough, the man immediately quieted down, even frothing at the mouth in gratitude to Rick. Seeing that the situation was getting out of hand, Rick quickly smoothed things over by claiming he had been confused by the alcohol and advised the onlookers not to drink counterfeit alcohol like he had. After obtaining his examination slip, when Elfelt, his master, inquired about his progress, Rick, distractedly staring at a woman with large breasts, gave irrelevant answers. Unbeknownst to Rick, the front desk was in chaos by then. His handprint had even left an imprint on a steel armor. Moreover, someone recognized the drunk man's identity. He was an A-class criminal recently wanted by the authorities. Soon, the first magic test began. Most participants were above level D, but when it was Rick's turn, everyone laughed at him. However, unbeknownst to them, as Rick left, the crystal ball cracked. The examiner, however, didn't care, assuming it was normal wear and tear. Then came the strength test, where the examiner scored participants based on the damage they inflicted on slime-filled punching bags. Rick was initially afraid, having trained with a golden slime as hard as dragon's teeth. Soon, a wealthy heir took the stage, hailed by all as a prodigious genius. Rick was curious about his strength. The heir struck a supremely cliched pose, drawing everyone's attention. However, when he launched a fireball, though it was very small, it received lavish praise from the audience. Rick, knowing that his lowly master could unleash fireballs not only larger, but also of nation-destroying power, began to suspect that the wealthy heir was deliberately suppressing his power. If so, he truly was a genius. When it was Rick's turn, seeing that he was a 30-year-old newbie adventurer and considering his poor magic test results, the examiner advised Rick to give up on becoming an adventurer. Rick was almost persuaded to quit, but remembering his years of effort, he assumed his strongest attack posture and smashed the punching bag. Despite the wealthy heir's displeasure, he restrained himself and proceeded to the next test. Unexpectedly, Rick not only easily defended against a 4th-tier magic attack, but also declared his intention to challenge a 5th-tier spell. Hearing this, the examiner became furious, feeling underestimated, and launched a powerful attack. As expected, the 5th-tier spell shattered the defensive barrier, but Rick remained completely unharmed. The Knight Captain's attention was captured by the tremendous uproar. Learning that Rick not only effortlessly blocked a 5th-tier magic spell, but also shattered a slime-filled punching bag with his bare hands, the Knight Captain became interested. After all the tests were completed, the wealthy heir came to cause trouble again. Annoyed by Rick stealing the spotlight all day, he was not pleased, but he wasn't foolish either. He directly brought in his sister Angelica, a 2nd-class knight of the kingdom, planning to teach Rick a lesson. Angelica casually threw her glove at Rick as a challenge for a duel. Rick, mistaking the glove for a free gift, was unaware that picking up the glove in the kingdom meant accepting the duel. With no choice, Rick followed her to the duel arena. As per tradition, both duelists could make a victory demand. Angelica demanded that the loser serve the winner until death, which seemed like an easy condition. However, Rick panicked upon hearing 2nd-class knight, comparable to a B-class adventurer, and even vomited on the spot, thinking he was just an F-class weakling. Encouraged by Elfelt, Rick gathered himself to face the duel. Angelica planned to intimidate Rick right from the start, so she buffed herself and launched her attack, instantly slicing through the iron bars behind her. Seeing Rick's shocked expression, she thought her move had intimidated him, but Rick was only rubbing his eyes in disbelief. When she attacked again, Rick found it too slow. Is this the Night Order's strength? He wondered. Unable to believe it, as her speed was comparable to a first-class knight, Angelica accelerated and executed her fastest sword technique. To Rick, however, it still seemed as slow as a snail. Just then, Angelica unexpectedly kicked a stone, causing her body to spin out uncontrollably like a windmill. This disorderly attack made Rick dismiss his thoughts of being strong. To ease the awkwardness, Angelica, trying to maintain composure, praised Rick for evading even such an attack and declared she would get serious now. She then used her tri-foot kill, a move she could only perform 3 times. Rick easily dodged it again. Angelica panicked. The move was too draining, but determined not to lose the duel, she used it again, only to be dodged once more. With only one chance left, she went all in. But another mishap occurred. A stone on the ground tripped her, causing her to fly low across the ground. Rick, thinking she was aiming for a crippling blow, stopped her with a punch, but accidentally used too much force, creating a huge crater. Angelica was dumbfounded, realizing she might have been knocked out if not for the trip. Rick regretted that his punch had deviated again. Terrified, Angelica asked who he was. Rick replied that he was just the worst F-class adventurer, a claim she couldn't believe. With no choice but to continue the duel, Rick was ready to fight, but for her own safety, Angelica quickly surrendered. As Rick was still in shock, she turned and left swiftly. But Rick wasn't foolish. "What about the stakes we agreed on?" he reminded. Angelica, realizing her predicament, turned pale and ran off quickly. That might have been the fastest she moved today. The novice Uncle Rick never expected that he would accidentally join the legendary team of adventurers, only to live a life like hell every day. After training desperately for 2.5 years, he unknowingly became the strongest S-rank adventurer on the surface. To him, mighty dragons were like toys. However, because he had never left the mountain during his training and was often ridiculed by his masters, Rick always thought he was still weak. A simple level 1 exam made Rick extremely nervous, only because Elfelt had once said that failing the exam would mean doubling the training workload upon returning, which was no different from a death sentence. Fortunately, he successfully passed the first stage of the assessment, and his hanging heart was finally able to relax. Just as he was preparing to leave, a pungent smell suddenly filled the air. A self-proclaimed handsome man named Raster approached to flirt with Elfelt. He was the eldest son of Duke Diarmoit, and the brother of Fried and Angelica, whom Rick had encountered earlier. Rick initially thought Raster was also a candidate and tried to greet him, but was met with a look of utter disdain. Raster then took Elfelt by the hand, started spouting cheesy love lines, and even proposed to make her his second wife. At this, Elfelt's eyes instantly filled with murderous intent. Seeing trouble, Rick quickly interrupted Raster, claiming that Elfelt was his girlfriend and that he couldn't just stand by. Raster, dismissive, laughed when he saw Rick's exam certificate. He couldn't help but mock Rick, noting that at Rick's age, he was still stuck at F rank, whereas he himself had advanced to E rank at the age of 14 and was now not only an A rank adventurer, but also the examiner for the second stage mock battle. Despite this, Elfelt still rejected his invitation. Angered and embarrassed, Raster vowed that if he became Rick's examiner in the second stage, he would show Elfelt the gap in strength between them, convinced that she would surely change her mind. At this point, Rick was speechless and prayed that he wouldn't encounter Raster. Suddenly, he felt a pressure on his arm and realized that Elfelt had been holding on to him the whole time. He also apologized to Elfelt for claiming she was his girlfriend without her consent, but she seemed quite happy with it. Unbeknownst to them, once Raster returned, Fried and Angelica complained to their brother about being bullied by Rick, swearing to make Rick understand the consequences of angering the nobility. The next day, as the mock battle was about to begin, Rick was extremely anxious, worried about actually facing Raster as the examiner. Then, a middle-aged man suddenly appeared with good news. His name was Lynx, and he was assigned as Rick's examiner for the mock battle. Hearing this, Rick was overjoyed. Lynx had sought out Rick after hearing about his determination, which greatly inspired him as a fellow middle-aged adventurer who had also started his career at the age of 24, harboring similar dreams. Although it took him 20 years to barely reach B rank. Even so, determined to climb to A rank to realize his dream, Rick found that Lynx, despite his age, was still fighting with a fiery passion, seeming like a friend with similar aspirations. Unbeknownst to them, their conversation was fully overheard by Raster, who was hiding nearby. When they reached the resting room, Rick thought he was lucky this time. But then, a staff member brought dire news. The originally assigned examiner, Lynx, had suddenly fallen ill, and Raster would be taking over as the examiner. This news terrified Rick so much that he choked. Other candidates also murmured complaints, because Raster, a noble from a distinguished family, had reached A rank at just 17 years old, not only hailed as a genius, but also known as the F-rank Terminator. It was rumored that he enjoyed tormenting the candidates he set his sights on each year. Hearing this, Rick paced nervously back and forth, afraid of being targeted by such a narrow-minded person, fearing the inhumane training that awaited him if he failed. Rick's lack of confidence stemmed from his late start compared to others, and his efforts along the way were often dismissed by others. Seeing this, Elfelt comforted him, saying that if one's confidence could be shaken by the words of others, conversely, it could also be stimulated by the words of others. Elfelt firmly believed that Rick was strong and would definitely pass the exam. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted. Freed, fully disguised, sweet-talked Rick, falsely offering to divine his fortune for free. Rick, unsuspecting, thought it would be a good omen before the mock battle. However, Elfelt felt something was off. The moment Rick sat down, a teleportation magic circle appeared on the stool. Before she could stop him, Rick was transported somewhere else. The next second, Elfelt reprimanded Freed. Meanwhile, Rick was transported outside the examination venue, confused and lost, when suddenly a group of people surrounded him. They were Raster's personal guard, intending to prevent Rick from participating in the exam. All present were adventurers of B rank and above. If Rick failed because of this, it would be embarrassing. At that moment, a voice was heard from afar. Rick's masters suddenly appeared. Rick was about to explain when he saw the minions behind him, so he lied, claiming they were just sparring before the exam. His bald master found this amusing and immediately offered to help. Rick panicked at once, urging the butler to lead people to flee, afraid they would all die here. But the butler, disdainful, immediately ordered them to be killed. However, the bloodbath Rick imagined did not occur. Instead, weapons shattered all over the ground. This infuriated the man, who then threw his weapon and violently attacked with his fists, only for his punch to be easily caught by the bald master. The next second, his palm was crushingly fractured, leaving the man in immense shock and fear. However, what was even more unexpected was that the opponent merely chanted for a moment, and the originally shattered palm was instantly healed. The bald master patiently instructed the weakling, telling him not to focus solely on strengthening his arms, but to always be aware that the body functions as a whole. This scene made the butler sweat profusely, and he seemed to faintly guess the identity of the other party. In fact, Master Mizet knew at a glance that they were here to cause trouble and immediately offered to resolve the situation peacefully for Rick. He then pulled out an American-style katana and started firing without a word, emptying the magazine and stunning Rick. Seeing the situation worsen, the man instantly took a little girl hostage. Upon seeing this, Rick urged the man to let her go quickly. However, the weakling was not likely to listen to reason, and she cast a high-level magic spell. At this moment, the butler also understood the identities of the group. The little girl, only 10 years old, was known as the strongest genius magician vampire in history. Mizet was a mix of dwarf and elf, possessing technology that seemed millennia ahead. The bald orc, both a monstrous creature of strength and possessing wisdom, along with the others, were not only the world's strongest S-rank adventurers, but also members of the legendary Orichalcum Fist squad. The butler never expected to see them with his own eyes one day, and immediately decided to retire, returning to the countryside to live out his life peacefully farming. Rick said he needed to go back and try hard on the exam and hurried away. At the same time, Freed was smug, believing that Rick, having been teleported away, could not safely return, especially with the family guard waiting for him. But unexpectedly, Rick suddenly appeared. Elfelt tossed Freed aside like trash. Just then, Lynx, weakened, walked over. From his mouth, Rick learned that Raster wanted to be Rick's examiner so badly that he had knocked him down deliberately, even asking about his own dreams. When he revealed his dream of building a school for aspiring adventurers in his remote hometown, he was brutally beaten and mocked, then locked up in a dark room. Although resentful, he could not refute Raster's words. He advised Rick to better give up on the exam, as the other party would definitely use all means to torment him. However, Rick interrupted him, insisting, "It's never too late to try new things, no matter how old one is." At that moment, Rick, extremely angered, immediately headed to the exam venue to teach Raster a lesson. Seeing his own guards shaking, Raster realized Rick had arrived. He had wanted Rick to lose his qualifications, to feel a devastating sense of powerlessness. But now that Rick had chosen to take the exam, he was ready to ruthlessly trample on his boring efforts and passion, to show him a fear that would make even hell pale in comparison. But Rick was not someone to be trifled with.